Today's reading, chapter 26, is called Pogrom in Reverse. It's about the book of Esther. The Jews have always been a persecuted race. Belsen and Auschwitz are the horrible climax to a long story of oppression and cruelty, which dates back to before the Christian era. Sometimes it seemed to the Jews as if suffering was all that they could expect. Sometimes, however, they've dreamt that the boot was on the other foot. And when this happened, there was little to choose between their tactics and those of their persecutors. The book of Esther tells of one such dream. It's unlikely that it was more than a dream, but the story was highly popular, as we might expect among people who like to think that on one occasion at least the tables had been turned. Before we condemn the book as sub-Christian, let us remember that most of the persecution of the Jews has been carried out by so-called Christian nations. The scene is laid in Susa, the capital of the great Persian Empire, in the days of the notorious Xerxes, called by the Hebrews Ahasuerus. He had arranged a kind of empire exhibition, which lasted about 6 months, and which was designed to impress officials from all over his far-flung dominions. At the end of it, he staged an enormous and magnificent open-air all-male banquet, which went on for 7 days. At the same time, his queen, Vashti, entertained the ladies correspondingly well inside the palace. The king's choicest wines were on tap, and towards the end of the feast, Xerxes, in a state of alcoholic exaltation, began to boast of the queen's beauty. In a misguided moment, he ordered the court chamberlain to produce the queen, so that her charms might be exhibited and praised by the whole company. Vashti, who had more sense, refused to come, whereupon the king flew into a drunken rage. He took counsel with his guests as to what should be done, and they unanimously decided that some drastic action must be taken. For Vashti was setting their wives a very bad example indeed. What was going to happen to a husband's authority if a wife could snap her fingers at a direct command? So Vashti must be deposed. Not only that, but a royal decree should be sent round the empire, ordering that every husband should be master in his own house, which is the kind of fatuous resolution that one would expect to issue from a drunken spree. The next step was to find a new queen. So a beauty competition was held to decide who was to be the Miss Persia of 483 BC. The prize in this case was to be the royal throne. Among the entrants was a certain Esther, a Jewess, of the same clan as King Saul. This beautiful orphan girl had been brought up by her cousin Mordecai, who was apparently one of the exiles of Nebuchadnezzar's first deportation. This would make him well over 100 years old, but dates don't matter to the fiction writer. Among other pieces of advice which Mordecai had given Esther was a strict instruction not to reveal her nationality, since the Jews at the time were none too popular. The lovely Esther took the king's fancy and was promoted from the royal harem to be queen in Vashti's place. Soon after this, old Mordecai, who had taken up his post outside the palace gate to keep an eye on Esther, discovered a plot against the king's life. He told Esther of this, she told the king, and the conspirators were hanged. Then the king appointed a new prime minister, Haman, who was a pompous ass. Everybody had to prostrate himself as he went past. The only man who refused to do so was old Mordecai. Haman took this as a personal affront, and determined to be revenged not only on him but on all Jewish people who were to be found within the bounds of the Persian Empire. He obtained the king's consent to a wholesale massacre of the Jews for an appointed day, and notices were sent out accordingly. The reason given by Haman for the extermination of the Jews was that they were different from anyone else and lived by their own laws. Then there went up a universal wailing and lamentation from the Jews throughout the land. Mordecai sent a message to Esther in the harem that the fate of the whole Jewish race was in her hands. She must approach the king and get the massacre cancelled. "Who knows," he said, "perhaps you have come to the throne for such a time as this." But according to the laws of Persia, it was as much as even the queen's life was worth to appear uninvited before the king. So while all the Jews in Susa fasted in sympathy, Esther and her maids-in-waiting fasted inside the palace in preparation for the ordeal. Finally, taking her life in her hands and robed in her royal attire, Esther ventured unsummoned into the king's presence. She caught him at the right moment. He was in a mood to give her half his kingdom. All she asked, however, was that the king and Haman should come to a little dinner party with no other guests apart from themselves. The king agreed, and Haman was beside himself with delight. He ran home to tell his wife, and even the sight of surly old Mordecai sitting tight and not even standing up as he passed through the palace gates couldn't spoil his pleasure, as he told Zeresh, his wife, what a wonderful chap he was, how the queen had singled him out, and how she was repeating the invitation on the following day. Yet, as Haman said, all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. This was the one fly in the ointment. What could he do about it? His wife and friends had a splendid idea. He must set up an enormous gallows about 100 feet high. Then tomorrow he must tell the king about Mordecai and his repeated insults and get the fellow hanged on it. Then he could really enjoy the dinner. That night, the king could not sleep. Having presumably tried all the traditional recipes for insomnia, he sent for the royal annals to be read to him. This would surely lull him to sleep. But when the courtier reached the point that told of the plot to kill the king that Mordecai had discovered, the patient suddenly sat up in bed and asked what had been done to reward this faithful subject. The reply was, "Nothing, sire." The king demanded action at once. Who was in attendance? As it happened, Haman, who could not wait to see his private plan for Mordecai mature in the morning, was pacing up and down in the courtyard waiting for the dawn. So Haman was brought in, and the king asked him what he thought would be a fitting reward for someone whom the king wished to honour. Haman, thinking this could be no one but himself, recommended a triumphal procession on horseback through the city, clad in the royal robes and wearing the imperial crown, with a herald in front proclaiming what it was all about. Judge the poor man's shock when the king told him that the person to be honoured was Mordecai, and that Haman's job was to lead the horse. After the procession, Mordecai came back to his seat at the palace gates, and Haman went home with his spirits at zero, to glean what comfort he could from the wife who had such bright ideas. All he got was the chilling advice to expect the worst. In the midst of his forebodings, the royal envoys appeared to convey him to Esther's little party. When the wine was flowing freely, the king asked the queen what favour she had to ask, and Esther begged for the lives of her people. For we are doomed, I and my people, to destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. The king, still apparently not aware that Esther is a Jew, asked the name of the villain of the piece. And Esther replies, "This wretch Haman." The king rushes out to the garden to cool off. Haman falls on the queen's couch, a suppliant for his life. One of the eunuchs standing by reminds the king on his return that there is a fine new gallows conveniently erected in Haman's garden, to which the king's reply is, "Hang him on it." So up went Haman instead of Mordecai, and the king felt a lot better. Then the tables were completely turned. Mordecai was made prime minister, and the Jews, instead of being massacred on the appointed day, were authorized by Xerxes to turn on their enemies instead. They had such a field day of slaughter that Esther gained permission for another day's killing in the capital. And as a special tidbit for her, the 10 sons of Haman were hanged like their father. So there was great rejoicing among the Jews, and they kept the day in annual remembrance as a happy festival. The story of Esther is much more like something out of the Arabian Nights than out of the Bible. It was viewed with great suspicion by the learned rabbis, and almost didn't get into the Bible at all. Martin Luther wished it had never been written. It is intensely nationalistic and vindictive, and the name of God is never even mentioned. There was undoubtedly a king called Xerxes, but there is no evidence outside the story itself that anything of this kind ever happened. The Jewish festival of Purim seems to date from the period when the Jews were part of the Persian Empire, and this story may have simply grown up around it to explain its origin.